Welcome to this webinar. This is a hospital-only discharge webinar on frailty and deconditioning. This is our learning event number 3. We've done 2 previous webinars as well, which are available to you. They're recorded if you want to view them, and we'll give you the link for that a little later on. This programme is part of the support that we're giving to the National Hospital-Only Discharge Programme. It's Workstream 1, which is supporting acute trusts with discharge for patients which probably don't require a huge amount of additional support. So this is really about focusing on what hospitals can do to discharge patients. 15 organisations are part of that programme currently, but this webinar is open to everybody. So you're all very welcome. The areas of focus have been identified by those 15 trusts, and that's why we're doing this webinar. So the areas of focus are supporting operational processes, ward and board rounds, frailty and deconditioning, and workforce. And again, all those webinars are available for you recorded, and we'll send you the link for that. This is part of our collaborative approach to that programme, where these are the learning events which underpin some of the coaching that we're providing to those 15 trusts. We've also got a library of resources that's available to you as well. We're doing 4 events per theme. And so this is event 3 for frailty and deconditioning, and they're clinically led by a multi-professional workforce with keynote speakers, and we're hopefully trying to provide you with top tips, not make it too complicated, but to provide you with some things that are practical that you can use now. We will have some questions and answers at the end of the speakers today, and we will keep an eye on the chat, so please do put any questions in the chat. These work streams are about showcasing good practice, really, and our objective is to optimise timely discharge for patients that have frailty. And we're also wanting to implement sort of sustainable data-driven changes of care as well. So a lot of data and a lot of information will be provided today, which will help you to identify some areas that you can improve and to just raise the awareness of system frailty. We've got 4 speakers for you today. So a colleague of mine, Dr. Amit Arora, is here, Anne-Marie Riley is here, Deborah Whittaker and Emma Brown. And I'm going to start by handing over to Amit, and he'll introduce himself to you. Thanks, Amit.
Good afternoon and welcome everyone. I hope you can hear me all right. I'm Amit Arora. I'm a geriatrician by clinical background, and I'm a clinical director with the Emergency Care Improvement Support Team, which is supporting the hospital-only discharge program, as Wendy mentioned. So today is all about frailty, deconditioning, and how can this help in improving hospital discharges. So most welcome to you all. And for those who have not been able to attend today, please pass on the message that the recordings will be available so they can see the recordings. And if they need any further information, feel free to contact any of our speakers, myself or Wendy Rees as your contact, and we'll do whatever is needed. So next slide, please. So deconditioning. When we started the work first a few years ago around deconditioning, I think one of the first things I was trying to do is to find out what is actually deconditioning in terms of a medical definition of it. And as you will see, it is summarized as a loss of physical fitness due to failure to maintain an optimal level of physical activity or training, and inactivity for any reason may lead to deconditioning. Now just imagine how many of your patients in hospitals are inactive for any reason, and is it leading to deconditioning? Next slide, please. So now we try and use this definition, which is deconditioning syndrome can be defined as the condition of physical, psychological, and functional decline that occurs as a result of complex physiological changes induced by prolonged bed rest and associated loss of muscle strength. It happens more commonly in older people, although as a young person, straight after my emergency appendectomy some 25 years ago, I experienced deconditioning myself for the first time. And I think my interest in deconditioning somehow relates back to my personal as well as professional experiences over the last few years. Next slide, please. So, but what actually happens when an older person gets admitted to the hospital? We may not actually be able to visualize it or define it immediately, but the impact of bed rest in older people starts within the first 24 hours by reduction in the muscle power, which goes down by up to 2 to 5%, by reducing the volume of blood that is circulating in the body by up to 5%. But guess what happens within the first 7 days? That 5% of reduction in circulatory volume is reduced by up to 25%. The muscle strength goes down by up to 5 to 10%. And it also affects other things. It increases falls, it reduces the skin integrity, leading to pressure ulcers, and to a lot of extent, it reduces what matters to older people the most, which is reduction in their dignity, the quality, their confidence, their independence, their choice. And guess what we are sometimes doing to a lot of older people who come to the hospital? And a lot of this is actually quite preventable. Next slide, please. So, what happens when the hospitalized patients are put to bed? Does that does this slide tell us that bed rest is a potentially harmful treatment and it needs more careful evaluation? And we will hear from Anne Marie Riley, who has done a really great job of defining harms and capturing harms, and you'll hear from her directly in the next 10 minutes or so. But what actually happens in the ward environment that you work in? I'll leave that for you to think about. That how many people are standing or walking, or how do they spend their time? Lying in bed for 20 hours, many of them. But we know from the science that those people who are mobile do better. Patients who are highly mobile, only 13% of those patients are disabled at discharge. Patients who are moderately mobile, 35% of patients are disabled at discharge. And those with have a very low mobility, 71% can be disabled on discharge. Now, this is only one paper, and papers can vary about their reports and things, but that just gives you a little bit of a flavor. Next slide, please. But what we do know is that physical activity impacts on physical function at many stages throughout life to change the trajectory of decline. So it does not matter at what stage do you take up physical activity, whether in hospitals or out of hospitals, because it will actually improve how you function. And how you function defines how is your quality of life. Next slide, please. Next one. And this is the cycle of frailty. This is quite a complex diagram. So without going into a huge amount of detail, if you look at the highlighted version of activity, activity then relates to everything. It relates to reduced walking speed. It then relates to disability and eventually dependency, immobilization, sarcopenia, falls, injuries, etc., etc. Activity is absolutely key, whether it is in the hospital or out of the hospital, for those in care homes and those who are living in their own homes. Next slide, please. Next one, next. And the other thing which is really important, which we often do not focus on, is that it is equally important for surgical patients, because pre-habilitation, rehabilitation before any surgery is equally important, because those patients who have had preoperative exercises and activity levels may experience a reduced risk of complications and a more rapid recovery through enhanced physical fitness. So absolutely vital. So although we focus a lot of time on our medical patients, this is really important to reduce the length of stay in surgical patients and also improve their recovery. But what happens, next slide please, what happens if they develop complications? So the studies show that if complications occur, those patients who have had prehabilitation may also still recover sufficiently to retain their independent functional status that they had before that surgery. So it does not just help in recovery, but it also helps in prevention of complications and recovery from complications. So absolutely vital that surgical patients also get a degree of activity and rehabilitation before the surgery. Next slide, please. But that was about what we can do. But here is something around the prognosis. Now, think about a stroke. What is the outcome in stroke? 30% of patients have full recovery, 30% of patients have some functional deficit, and 30% of patients uh, could be could could lose their life. Very similar to a stroke patient is the prognosis of deconditioning. And now I'll leave you with a question. If it was a stroke or a heart attack or emergency surgery, would you get away with not treating it? It will be really, really hard to explain how can we let our patients decondition in the hospital when we are responsible for their care. Next slide, please. There are lots of benefits of staying active in the hospital. I won't go into details, but I think the important thing is how we can actually keep our patients active in the hospital. And my colleagues who you will hear from in the next 10-15 minutes, Debbie and Emma will explain to you how the teams in East of England did an excellent job of their own uh, patients and how they developed their own techniques, what they did, a lot of helpful, pragmatic, practical solutions without being told what to do. So I'll leave that to Debbie and Emma. And next slide, please. I think the important thing here is that the bottom line of this slide is if we can activate our patients while they are in the hospital, we could actually change a lot of outcome. And prevention of deconditioning could be the difference between someone going to their own home or in a care home. And that comment is from my very dear friend Brian Dolan, who you would know. He's the pioneer for NPJ paralysis. And I'll come back to NPJ paralysis social movement campaign in a second, and maybe the next slide. So, next slide, please. But this is again from the brilliant Anne Marie Riley, who actually really touched me when I first saw this slide, and I use it quite often. Thank you, Anne Marie. And if this behind the curtain thing was your visitor toilet, would you use it? No, I wouldn't. I wouldn't. Next slide, please. And then how many of us would want to choose to eat our meals and lying in a bed? And actually, even if there was a table like the second slide has, can this person actually reach her glass and the straw? Can we do something about it? There are simple basic things we can sometimes we can't. Right, next slide, please. I think the important thing to realize is that all these things are real common sense. They're obvious, they're logical, but we do not address them routinely. And there are lots of reasons for it. And some of them are very justifiable, and some of them are very legalistic, and some of them are related to workforce shortages. And I think it is really important to understand why this might be the case. But equally important is to what we can do about this. Next slide, please. And I'm not talking about mobilizing every person, and I'm not talking about getting every person on a treadmill. And I think there's a lot to talk about the personalized care and personalized goals and shared decision making with staff. And there will be obvious some medical and nursing considerations when we can't do that. And not to forget that if we are dealing with one person who is very actively mobile through encouragement, we could be actually uh, in some ways discouraging the person in a negative way that the I can't do this thing while the patient in the bed next to me could do it. So there's a lot of personalization, and we need to be mindful of that. So next slide, please. But what does all this actually do? So when Brian Dolan and Anne-Marie Riley and Pete Gordon, my dear friend, who is a mentor for me in my ESIS work as well, they did all this work initially in east of England and then across England, and the results were absolutely stunning, because if you can see, it improved the 4-hour performance, it reduced the occupied bed days, it reduced the number of stranded patients, and it also improved the time to treatment, just simply by promoting activity and independence to prevent deconditioning in the hospitals. And that's how it links in with the hospital only discharge program, because there is a lot we can do. Yes, we have constraints, but where there is a will, there is a way. Next slide, please. And of course, we cannot provide all the rehab that we want for every patient, but then that's when we start with awareness and prevention. And it's not just the doctor's business or the nurse's business. Everybody has a role to play, whether it is a porter, whether it's a pharmacist, whether it is the trust executives, NHS as a whole, and beyond, including our families. Next slide, please. And then we will hear from Debbie and others about how we can prevent deconditioning in the settings within our hospitals. And not to forget care homes. Next slide, please. And if there are any burning questions, I'll take them now, but otherwise we can do them a little bit later. But I'll hand it over to Wendy and Anne-Marie Riley.
Thanks, Amit. That's great. Thank you very much. So, but a question from Lucy around what is the definition of the older person in some of your statistics, Amit?
Yes, so I think a lot of variations happen there, and some people will regard a age definition of 65. Some will define it as 75. Personally, I don't think 65 is classed or should be classed as old anyway these days, because most of us will be working till we are 67 or even 17 in the next few years. Who knows? But I think I would rather go with the clinical frailty scale, which will define frailty, and some of you will be aware of that. But if you Google the clinical frailty scale, I think I would go with I would go with the clinical frailty scale and the biological definition rather than the chronological aging.
Thanks, Amit. That's really helpful. And one of our guests just asked around what's happened to NPJ paralysis.
Oh, well, it's still on. It's still on. We still work very much together. And I think towards the end of this, I think the last slide of this will tell you where we are going with that. So just hang fire for another 20 minutes and you'll hear a lot about that.
Thanks, Amit. That's great. So I'm going to hand over now to Anne-Marie Riley. Thanks, Anne-Marie.
My name's Anne-Marie Riley. I'm Chief Nurse at University Hospitals North Midlands. Very fortunate, I know, work with Amit, and I just want to say thank you for inviting me. So in probably about 5-6 years that we've been involved, particularly with the NPJ paralysis campaign, there's been a lot of work done to raise awareness around deconditioning and the harms. But as the picture does suggest, I do think there are many organisations that have got their head in the sand and don't really understand from a data or oversight perspective what is happening in their organisations around deconditioning harm, and it'll become clearer why I believe that as we move through the presentation. So the next slide. So why do we keep focusing on this? And it's because, as Amit's already highlighted, it's really bad for patients. Never mind what it does operationally. You know, this can be life-changing for patients, and it's got the potential to disrupt probably almost every organ system in an individual, and obviously Amit's covered some of that. So if we go to slide 3, which covers some of what Amit's done, so I'm not going to repeat that, but what I will share is some of the research findings, and these are different studies, most of them on around older people, not all of them. But when we share some of the stats that are found when this subject is researched, I think this potential scale of harm is much clearer, and I think we're all duty bound to reflect on our own practice, and that's what I do a lot of time when I'm talking. It's about asking people to reflect and hold a mirror up to what could be happening in their own organisations. And so I'll share these, and then it'll be interesting what people think if any of this happens in their trust, or whether they would know it would happen. So 17% of older medical patients who were walking independently 2 weeks before admission needed help to walk on discharge. Patients spend up to 83% of their time in bed. For 60% of patients who stay in bed, there's absolutely nothing documented to explain why. 50% of older patients experience functional decline between admission and discharge. 50% of older patients become incontinent within 24 hours of admission. Now, I tested this one. I was so appalled at it that I thought it couldn't be true. And one of the trusts that I've worked in, we did a bit of a piece of work to understand, what could this be happening in the trust I was in? And it wasn't quite 50%, but it wasn't far off, where people who before admission were perfectly happy to go to the toilet, and then within a very short period of time were incontinence products, and those stayed on for the whole of their admission. So I think it's testing some of this to see, does it happen in your own trust? So deconditioning contributed to delayed discharge in more than 40% of older patients. Once discharged, only 30% of those with a new additional activity of daily living disability were back to their usual level of function after a year, which is just astounding. 24% of patients who had no documented ambulation, 24% of patients had no documented ambulation during a week's length of stay. 72% of patients considered able to walk did not walk at all, and that's not older person specific. So that's even younger people who are quite capable of walking when they come to hospital don't. Declining walking ability occurs in up to 50.9% of hospital older patients, and as Amit said, can begin within 24-48 hours of admission. And finally, one study highlighted that 65% of older people were deconditioned after 48 hours in hospital, and of those, 67% failed to improve before discharge, and 10% actually deteriorated further. And I think when you start looking at the research evidence, actually it's stark. The potential level of harm is really significant, and for some of these patients, as I said, is life-changing. If we move to the next slide, so how would you know that this was happening in your hospital or not? And I would suggest that for most trusts, the best that you've got is something like this that tells you what happens around falls. And my question would be, is what assurance does this give you? Because there is nowhere that I know of in the UK, apart from one trust that we implemented it in, that captures deconditioning harm. So the only evidence we've got is, do people fall? Now, we can make something like this happen by limiting people's mobility. It doesn't tell us that people are not coming to harm. It just says that they're not falling. And I think we've got to start thinking much better around the metrics we use to understand deconditioning harm. When I was in Nottingham, we started to report deconditioning harm on Datex, and it was very crude. I'm not saying it was the best way to do it, but at least we started getting people to talk about harm. And it'd be good to know if anybody else does it, because when I started to talk about this, I couldn't find anyone anywhere internationally that was doing it. So I couldn't pinch with pride. We just had to design something that at least started a conversation. We're doing exactly the same now. I'm here at UH&M. So if we go to the next slide, so this, I won't read it out. If you read it, it's a pretty typical thing that you'll see if somebody's admitted independent before admission, and then for whatever reason, as you read through, doesn't go back home as planned. So my question is, she quite clearly has had some element of deconditioning. So what would your organisation consider in terms of her case? Would we investigate why somebody who was perfectly independent before they came in hospital clearly has suffered some decline and was not able to return home? Is there any investigation so that we can learn? Because if there isn't, how many cases like Ellen are happening up and down the country where people are being harmed and we learn nothing from that experience so that we can change practice? And that fundamentally feels very wrong for me. So Ellen is based on somebody I know, and she was on a trolley in ED for a really long period of time, and this was before COVID, so it's only worse now. You know, if you look at what's happening up down the country, and she was perfectly capable of sitting in a chair, but she was on a trolley. She refused medication because she didn't want to be in hospital, and she thought if she accepted medication, she thought she was sicker than she was, she wouldn't get home. And even though she was clearly in discomfort, nobody sat down with her to understand why she was refusing the medications, and her not taking a painkiller actually made her stay in longer because she was finding it difficult to move. Nobody on the MDT asked why she wasn't walking. So at the board round, her inactivity wasn't discussed. Because she wasn't comfortable to move, there was no push to take her to the toilet, and she went very quickly from somebody who was using a toilet at home to be using a cloth and a pad. And then she didn't get home, and that was massive for her. It took Helen a year to get back to her normal self. She became really depressed, she was very stressed and anxious, and it took a really long time for her to get back to what we would recognise as her normal self. And actually nearly all of what happened to her was preventable. And it's part of the reason why I'm so passionate about it, because I've seen it happen firsthand, and most nurses and clinicians that I do speak to know somebody where this has happened to them. And again, we're duty bound, I think, to be learning and improving our practice around that. So if we go to the next slide then. So what can we do? And I think there's some really simple things that we can do, and there's some that might need a board decision, like do we put it on Datex? So I think the first thing is be curious. If people who, you know, as we're assessing them, we're clearly independent at home, and then they're suddenly not in hospital, does anybody ask why? There's an easy thing to do is say, why aren't they at that level of activity? There'll be a whole realm of reasons why they're not, but at least we're starting to ask why. And do we have the right metrics to be able to understand what happens to people? A bit like that Foles chart. Do we look at the right data to inform practice? I think on board rounds, every single member of the MDT has got an opportunity to change this agenda and make people's outcomes better. And the first one of those can be at the board round, a simple conversation around. So how many, I quite often post, if you follow me on Twitter, on a Friday, so who's going to look on Monday to see how much, Bob moved over the weekend? So if you didn't do any steps at all, the chances are he started to decondition, and if we don't ask about it on a Monday, we're losing opportunities to prevent further harm to him. So I think there are some things that we can do that are quite simple, don't cost any money, it's just a conversation. We can tell people about what the risk is of not moving. If you Google on hospitals on Google, what you'll get is a picture of somebody in bed. That's the image that comes up again and again, and we need to educate people that actually being inactive is not good for them, and the reasons why, and why we're going to encourage them to keep active, or exercise in a chair or whatever it might be to keep their muscle function going. There is something around us not assuming that a hospital is a safe place. It's safe if you need acute care, but when that acute care is over, we do know that people will come to harm, they get infections, they decondition, and we've got to be open and honest about the fact that happens. But again, we need to start talking about it and capturing it to be able to have open conversations about it. As I said, we can do simple exercises. Some really great work happening up down the country. If you watch on Twitter, where people are being encouraged, whether it's little static motors, the cycles where they've got goals to get to. There was one chap who was cycling from where he was somewhere in England to where his hometown was in Scotland, and following it on a little map. So the really simple things we can do. We can review the audit process. Do we look for this enough? Are we curious enough? And we can think of, do we need to report the harm? So some of the simple things, some of the things we're doing at UHM, we are changing some of the language. So we're writing ambitions around safe mobility rather than focusing on falls prevention. And it's a really simple change of language, but actually it's getting people to think about enabling people, not restricting people. So we're doing that across a range of harms. We are trying to capture early if there's a change in function. So most trusts will do some sort of monthly audit around nursing documentation and that type of thing. We're building into ours, has somebody lost function since that last audit or since admission. Again, it's just adding it into a process that we've got already, with the aim that we can try and prevent that harm happening. We are looking to introduce mobility goals. We're working with Johns Hopkins in America. They've developed a tool, and we're working with them to see to implement it here. And that will be for all adult inpatients. So we can start to be able to set goals with patients when they want to, around keeping mobile and active, and then us capturing that and being able to report on it. So we're going to introduce incident reporting for here as well. So hopefully it's a whistle stop tour of the harm and what some simple things we can do. But one of this quote is about all incident reporting, not just deconditioning. But if we better report, that enables us to respond. Actually, we can save. It's not just the money, but we can massively positive impact on patient outcomes, and that's what we're here for. So hopefully that was helpful. It's not meant to be teaching people to suck eggs, but it's just to get people to question their own practice. So thank you.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. That's great. There was just a question around the data that you gave out from one of our guests, Maria. Have you got the source of the data that you quoted around some of the statistics around harm that was happening to patients?
So all of that is research papers. So if it's helpful, if I send it through to you yourself and Amit, and then they can circulate it.
Yeah,
do that.
We could circulate it with the slides from this webinar to everybody. Yes, that would be great. Thanks, Anne-Marie. Thank you so much. So I'm going to hand over now to our next guest, which is Debbie and Emma, who will be pleased to introduce themselves. Thanks, Debbie and Emma.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting us here today to talk about the amazing work that's happened in the east of England with the Winter Deconditioning Games. So I'm here today with Debbie Whittaker, who is a nurse but the regional lead for Discharge and Quality in the east of England, and I'm a physiotherapist and a clinical fellow. So next slide, please. So just a little bit of background about the games. It started when we were probably in one of our most challenging winters ever. So the winter just gone, and it started at the beginning of November, the games, and went through to the end of February, but was actually extended by a month because that's what teams asked for that were participating. And it was really to do something practical and to do something to have a positive impact for patients and reduce the harm that was caused by deconditioning, which has been spoken about earlier today. So we had 178 teams participated, and that was across health and social care. And I think that was very key to make it across the system and to make it open to all. And yeah, we had a huge number of teams participate across care homes, acute hospitals, and in community settings. And it was something that really boosted staff morale. That's the feedback that we actually got from people, even though it was one of the most challenging winters. Actually, it was the right thing to do. And that was our feedback from clinicians. They felt that, as I say, staff morale was boosted, and it actually empowered staff to do something positive with great outcomes for the people that they were working with. Next slide, please. So what were we aiming to do? We were aiming to raise awareness of deconditioning across health and social care settings. And actually, as the games went on, we were aware that there was little knowledge in some areas. And so it was really about increasing that. It was about having fun and being creative. So we weren't prescriptive about what people had to do. It was what was right for the setting that people were working in and for the staff. And it was really about preventing that harm caused by deconditioning and helping with the flow throughout the hospital, helping to facilitate discharge and enable people to return home where we know they recover better. So we're going to share a short 3-minute video which really demonstrates the amazing work that happened across the region. Great, thank you. So I hope you enjoyed that video, which really showed the huge number of teams that participated across the region, as I said, in both health and social care. So we had 4 medal categories, and those were making a difference, supporting people to keep active, using data to inform improvements in care, and supporting staff to keep active and well. And Debbie will talk later about the first 2 medal categories and some examples that we had from across the region. But what was also really important is that we had initiatives actually for staff wellbeing, because we needed staff to be active and well to do the best for the patients in their care. So that was hugely important. And just to say that we gave out gold, silver and bronze medals depending on the initiatives, and gold for those that really had made sustainable change and embedded in their practice as business as usual. Next slide, please. So we touched on it in the video, but in category 1, making a difference, the Tour de L&D was hugely successful and has actually led on to our summer initiative, which is the Tour de East of England. And this was a really simple initiative, which was about using static pedals on wards and enabling people to actually look at the distance that was travelled. So we had some brilliant outcomes, which really showed the positive impact it had on people's independence and their mobility, and a huge number of miles were clocked up. And you can see that some of the comments here that we had directly from patients, with one just saying it felt so good to get in my own clothes instead of the hospital gown as well. So that was also encouraged alongside the use of the pedals. Next slide, please. So I'm going to hand over to Debbie now, who's going to talk about some more of the initiatives.
Thanks very much, Emma. So making a difference was a really popular category, and what it allowed people to do was to be really creative and to personalise those quality improvement projects to focus on what matters most to the patients they were looking after. So you can see on the left-hand side, patients having their dialysis treatments using quite posh static pedals that fit on the end of beds, and some of the feedback from those patients. So the team there very much developed health and well-being plans for their patients, and for some of them, weight loss was a really important part of their plan, because for some of them, they were living with huge numbers of comorbidities, but also it may mean the difference of them getting onto the transplant list. There were some really simple ideas. So Winter Wimbledon is one of my favourites. It was a stroke unit at Mid and South Essex. They bought some fly swats and some balloons, and they launched a Winter Wimbledon campaign. And it was very much became part of their the patient's rehab programme, but it introduced meaningful activity, had fun, and had some really positive outcomes for those involved. Interestingly, they're also doing a summer Wimbledon currently, and patients are really enjoying being outside, carrying on the great work. Where we had the MDT working together on projects, we really did see some amazing outcomes. And one example is where the neuroscience ward at Norfolk and Norwich Hospital, the therapy assistants and the healthcare assistants worked together to come up with a solution for supporting the high volumes of number of patients that needed support at meal times, especially during the pandemic, and reduced visiting times. And the teams upskilled each other. So the therapy assistants learned to support patients who needed support at meal service, and the healthcare assistants learned much more about how you can really build some rehab into that activity. Care homes did some amazing work. So the Essex care homes, well, across the whole region, but especially the care homes in Essex, one of their initiatives was that they introduced pedometers. And the residents helped co-design this challenge of an Essex coastal walk. One care home, Mundy Care Home, wanted to walk the distance from their where they lived to Southend, which was 326 miles. And they did it, they achieved it. And they got on a coach together to celebrate, and they drove to Southend just to see how far they had actually walked, and they had afternoon tea to celebrate. Next slide, please. So category 2 was about supporting people to keep moving, and somebody asked earlier, where is NPJ paralysis? And this is very much building on that campaign and that initiative, because part of this campaign was to look at where we'd got best practice happening and to relaunch and re-energise some work. So we set 2 challenges. One was to increase the number of people who were up and dressed in time for lunch each day, and the other was the number of people with an activity goal set each day. And this was, so we gave teams, one of the real wins, I think, of this campaign was about making it simple for people to get involved. So we provided all of the resources that people needed, an SPC chart to plot the dots each day, to monitor their progress, some posters and some leaflets for patients and for staff, as well as some ICANN posters and some other resources. And next slide, please. I think what really blew us away was that people really there was huge numbers got involved with this, but they really personalised it. There was a real recognition that there's bedside boredom is a real problem for people in hospital and all health and social care settings. But equally, there was a renal ward who were struggling to make sure that patients were consistently weighed daily. So they had number of patients who were up, dressed and weighed each day. The Frailty unit on the top right-hand side, they encouraged their staff to come up with different challenges each month during the campaign, and that has continued since. So at Christmas, you can see the Christmas tree. They gave craft materials to patients and supported or encouraged them to make Christmas decorations, and then they walked and hung their decorations on the trees that were dotted around their Frailty unit. There was A&E departments or emergency departments that got involved. There was a huge amounts of creativity in this space. Next slide, please. So as our video said, this is just the beginning. So our Tour de East of England launched on the 1st of July alongside the Tour de France. And for the question that was in the chat, we don't have yellow jerseys, we have blue NHS jerseys. So there are certificates for people to be awarded to recognise and reward achievements. And you can see the creativity that is taking place. We've got pedometers attached to walking frames. We've got so much activity on Twitter. We've got them plotting their route. Interestingly, that was week 1 of 6 wards in a hospital who have collectively travelled 95 miles already. Mr. Motivator is supporting us with some resources to support people waiting well and to really keep the bay exercises and the chair exercises going that so many of the teams started. Innovation Cave, we offered some small amounts of funding at the end of our campaign, because what we were very aware of was that teams were coming up with some solutions where we could use technology and small investments to really get creative in this space. So we're hoping to be able to share their journey over the next few months. As Emma said, there was a real gap in knowledge, not just around deconditioning, but also around frailty identified in many of the teams that were involved. So Brian Dolan supported us with running some masterclasses. But what many of the teams have done is they've developed their own bite-sized training sessions and introduced it as part of their preceptorship programs and their care certificate programs to really close that gap and energise this work in the future. And Amit promised that we'd have some news about what next for nationally. So our Games is going to go national this winter. We're going to recondition the nation, and I hope that we have given you a taster of how creative teams can be. We will encourage you to pinch with pride. The Futures platform, we'll put the link in the chat, for the East of England is accessible to all of you, and you can come and grab as many resources and things off of there that will help you on your journey. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you very much, Debbie and Emma. That's really helpful, and it does really show, doesn't it, that there are some simple things that we can all do, all take responsibility and reduce the harm that's happening to patients. There's not a huge amount of questions in the chat at the moment, but there's some really good tips and advice, etc. So if you've got any questions, please raise your hand. I just wanted to say that Marcella at Northampton is they're launching their own deconditioning games, which is fantastic to hear, in August. And while people are having to think about questions, Andrew Rochford, if you're there, could you just expand a little bit more about how you mentioned the MUST tool and nutrition as an indicator? Thanks, Andrew.
Oh, yeah. Hi, everyone, and thank you for a brilliant webinar so far. A really diverse sort of mix of practical tips and clinical evidence. It's been fantastic. I was rather hoping, Wendy, you'd ask me to expand on the colour jerseys for the Tour de France, which
we haven't got enough time, Andrew,
well, that would
for
probably be more up my street and expertise. I wanted to highlight and link in sort of, and it's come up in a chat a little bit about some of the other things. So I'm a gastroenterologist and have an interest in clinical nutrition. Those patients who are often frailest are often most malnourished, and so the malnutrition universal screening tool, which should be done on every patient at admission and weekly, therefore, provides a good surrogate marker as well as looking at falls. We also, I guess, I'll be interested in other people's thoughts about Waterloo scores, those kind of things, other surrogate markers that could be representing frailty. And I put something in the chat around pressure ulcers and the risk of pressure ulcer care, developing pressure ulcers for length of time in ED. So the malnutrition universal screening tool should be done on all inpatients at the point of admission and weekly. And those at highest risk are probably those at highest risk of deconditioning. And we know that we've highlighted the importance of nutrition and hydration, or adequate nutrition and hydration for those patients. So it was just to give some people some thoughts around that. But happy to take some comments on polka dot jerseys, yellow jerseys, green jerseys, and yeah.
I'm sure you would, Andrew. Thank you so much. That's really helpful. And Joshua's put a really good comment in around the fact that, we do need to change the way we think, but word is certainly getting out there. But I think what this webinar has done really well is to say that everybody has got a role. You don't need to be highly trained. You can all do something that will make a difference. Amit, you popped your hand up, although not virtually. There was a physical hand up. Did you want to say something?
Yes, so just on the same comment from Joshua, and thanks, Joshua, for raising this and reminding me of this. So about a year or two ago, we actually produced some specific resources around deconditioning, and we have arranged it with the councils of deans for pharmacy, nursing, and medical students to include deconditioning in the curriculums of these students. And this has been done through another colleague of mine, Anne Bates, who has some kind of who has got some working relationship with the councils of deans through the Erasmus program. So work is ongoing on that. So you are absolutely spot on, Joshua, and thank you for raising that.
Thank you, Emma. That's really helpful. So if there are any other questions, just please pop your hand up. With our other speakers, is there any sort of last thoughts or anything you wanted to add from today? I'll come to you, Anne-Marie, if that's okay.
I think the key thing is to do something. It doesn't matter how small it is, just to start. And it's just, if currently, obviously staffing is a challenge everywhere, but as you'll have seen from some of the examples, not all of it is staff intensive. Some of it isn't, and if staffing is impacting on our ability to keep people mobile, then we should report it in the same way that we do if we can't turn people or we can't give them the medicines, or we raise red flags for those, yet we don't think if we can't walk somebody that should be a red flag. And all of that can be done in each individual organisation, but I think the key for me is just do something. Even if it's something small, it will be a positive impact.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. That's really helpful. I really like your approach around that safe mobility rather than falls prevention. I think some of it's language, isn't it, as well? It's how we approach things. So that is really helpful. Debbie, anything from you?
I would echo what Anne-Marie said, just have a go at doing something. And Brian Dolan did some masterclasses for us, and he asked the question to those in attendance about what is it that we do every day that causes harm to our patients. And I think if we all ask those questions in practice, it gives you a wealth of opportunities or improvement opportunities. And I think what the games really showed was that keeping it simple means that everybody can get involved. Don't need to do driver diagrams. Use PDSAs. You need to think about what difference you're making, but actually encourage everybody at every level to get involved and have some fun. And that was, I think that's the most important thing.
Thanks, Debbie, and it's fun for the staff too. I think that's really important as well, isn't it? It's keeping us healthy as well, and also a good role modelling as well, in terms of as long as we're healthy and active, then other people will think actually that's how I want to be. So I think that's an important message. Emma, any last words from you?
For me, it's just having a real MDT approach that's together with the nursing staff, the therapy staff, the medical team to really make a difference. So we've had feedback from therapists that unfortunately sometimes people are left in bed waiting for a therapy assessment. That has to change. That absolutely has to change, and the risk that's causing. So it needs to be a massive team approach to really make a difference and get people out of bed and get them moving and get them walking to the toilet instead of wearing pads or, you know, having a commode taken to their bedside. So it's those simple changes that can have a massive impact.
Thanks, Emma. That's fabulous. There was a hand up. Was it from Pat? Did you have your hand up? Has it gone down again? Are you there? No worries. Pop your question in the chat. We can also. Oh, Tina. Thank you. Tina, are you there?
Hi there. Yeah, my name's Tina. I'm a matron in trauma and orthopaedics at Tunbridge Wells, and we have noticed a huge amount of kind of pre-hospital deconditioning during the COVID pandemic. An awful lot of our, I mean, 86% of our patients are over 65. Over half of our patients are over 80, even though it's, you know, standard trauma. And we've seen a huge rise in hip fractures. We've seen a huge rise in frailty pre-hospital. And so our patients, now that they've come in and are fractured, we are a entirely single room hospital. So all of our patients are completely isolated. So we're working on a project at the moment on getting more patients up, dressed and moving. I was really lucky a few years ago to meet some of these guys and do the NPJ paralysis project for our trust. And we saw some huge changes in the quality of care then, but it feels like we've gone backwards and back some more since then. Anne-Marie, I listened to you talk at a conference and you were exceptionally inspiring. That passion that I developed there and then has never gone away. So thank you very much for that. And Pete Gordon and Amit, I've read your article in the, I can't remember which journal it was now, about the recent effects of hospital deconditioning. So it's something I feel really passionate about. We're creating a large patient lounge area that's got picture windows over a forest, and we're trying to find some ring-fenced roles that can keep patients, you know, can entertain these patients and do some meaningful activities with them. But what I'm struggling with, and I'm sure a lot of places are, is still a real risk-adverse culture with COVID. I don't know if anyone else has managed to work their way around that. Is my question.
We'll go quickly, Debbie, just for a minute, and then we need to close. But thank you, Tina. That's really helpful. And as a community nurse, again, we are responsible in the community as well for keeping people active. It's not just about hospitals. So everybody has a role to play. Debbie, I'll go over to you just for 1 minute, please.
I haven't got a secret answer about the risk adverseness, I'm afraid, but there's lots of chat about there's lots of conversation in the chat box around mobility and that discussion that Emma had about that it's everybody's responsibility. But I think what we found is that some teams need some support with building confidence again to do that. So for whatever reason that stopped, it is about understanding the root causes and supporting that improvement together.
Yeah, Thank you so much, Debbie. So thanks, everybody. So this was the third webinar in our series. There's another webinar coming up in the 20th of September. This is the one webinar we want to hear from you. So over the summer, when you're working on some of these amazing improvement projects for patients, please do come and share them with us. There's an email address on the flyer for you to make contact with Rob Kemp to propose a short presentation of the work you're doing. We'd love that very much. Feedback's really important to us because we want these webinars to be useful, and we want to know if we're pitching it right, or if there's any improvements we can make at all. So please do use this QR code. It will be available, and we'll also send it out again when we send the presentations to you as well. All the links to the recordings will be available to you when we send out the presentation, and also our resource library is also available to you. So I'm going to close by saying thank you so much for attending. What a great group, and thank you so much to the presenters today. It just makes me feel really privileged to work with such enthusiastic people. So thank you, everybody, and goodbye.